Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Britain must stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, says a key report by MPs, amid allegations they're being used against international humanitarian law on civilians in Yemen. But there was serious disagreement between MPs on the Arms Export Control Committee, and a rival report says let the sales go on. Both groups, however, demand an independent UN inquiry into the bombing of rebels in Yemen by the Arab coalition of which Saudi Arabia is part. Our chief correspondent Alex Thompson reports.
Saudi Arabia is a vital part of the Arab coalition fighting the Iranian-backed rebel uprising in Yemen. And the UK sells arms to Saudi Arabia, lots of arms. And those arms inevitably, says one parliamentary committee today, are being used by the Saudis to break international law and kill civilians. The committee said today an independent international inquiry is urgently needed to investigate this, and crucially,
until that has been completed, the UK must halt the sale of all weapons that could be used in the conflict between the Saudi-led coalition and rebel forces in Yemen.
But Parliament's divided. This afternoon, in an extraordinary piece of committee theatre, just as the joint business and development committees were saying stop the arms going to Saudi, the Foreign Affairs Committee also reported.
The committee considers that the courts are the most appropriate body to judge whether the government has broken the law. This will now be established in the upcoming judicial review granted to the campaign against arms trade.
So they don't want a ban, but they also do want an international inquiry. However, that committee also noted that no matter how important our relations with Saudi Arabia might be, wider moral and legal considerations are ultimately more important. And the Saudis themselves, well, they continue to insist their bombing campaign is carefully targeted.
Britain and America are allies. They know how this war started. They know that we have a legitimate purpose in this war. They know we are being extremely careful in minimizing civilian casualties, and they know that we have in place a mechanism to investigate and make sure that we take procedures that prevent any repetition of mistakes from happening, just like happens in all wars.
But on the ground, the misery for Yemenis deepens. Channel 4's Unreported World recently finding that hundreds of thousands of civilians face malnutrition because it is alleged the Arab coalition of which Saudi is a part have bombed warehouses and the infrastructure to deliver food.
Now, the chair of that joint committee on arms export controls, the Conservative MP Chris White, is in Warwick, and we're joined from Putney in South London by Nadeem Zahawi, a Conservative member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. They're the ones who said keep selling the arms. Chris White, first of all, Britain has sold about £3 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia since the war in Yemen began. To want to halt that, you must be very concerned indeed at how the weapons are being used. Can you tell us about the evidence you heard that international law was being broken?
We've heard a great deal of evidence on the committee being set up earlier this year to look specifically at the conflict in Yemen, as you've mentioned on your programme already, in terms of warehouses, in terms of building, in terms of civilians. We've spoken to NGOs that are very clear that there have been violations on international humanitarian law. And I think the conclusion that we have reached, unfortunately and regrettably, between just two committees, the Business Committee and the International Development Committee, makes a very clear case that we should cease the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia until we have clearly had a United Nations-led international investigation of what has been happening on the ground.
What happened in this disagreement? Because Crispin Blunt, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, has been accused of walking out and basically, ignoring the democratic will of the committee. Is that true?
The committee meets in private to discuss reports of this nature, and as far as I'm concerned, what took place in that committee will remain private.
OK, Nadeem Zahawi, you voted through this alternative report by Crispin Blunt to say we should carry on with weapons sales. Did you read all the oral and written evidence given to the Arms Export Control Committee before making that decision?
We looked at it very carefully, Krish. Earlier in the week, we published a report into the intervention in Libya, where we were deeply critical of the previous government for not following the evidence and having robust evidence, intelligence. You quite rightly introduced this piece by saying these are allegations. There are allegations of atrocities on both sides.
Yeah, did you read all the evidence?
The Houthi militia who initially... Well, absolutely, we looked at this, and what
you did personally
the final
before
conclusion,
voting
yes,
through. Yeah.
Let me just finish this point. If you believe that the Saudi-led coalition, which includes Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and other countries, intentionally seek to hurt civilians and bomb them as part of their campaign in Yemen, then you ought to vote in favour of the Kayak report that's been voted on by 2 committees, not all 4 committees that make up. We do not believe on the Foreign Affairs Committee that there is evidence that clearly shows the intention of the Saudi-led coalition to actually harm civilians. There have been mistakes made, of course. We are very, very strongly condemning those atrocities. We strongly recommend that the Saudis are much more transparent about the way they investigate it and in a timely manner. But you've got to remember, you need the evidence for this. Otherwise, you're just seen as being politically motivated and reactionary.
And in case the Saudis don't let in that international inquiry, we'll just carry on selling them the jets and the bombs anyway. Despite all that evidence from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty, all the views of international charities like Oxfam.
Well, we had the Saudi foreign minister meet a cross-party delegation, and people like Hilary Benn and others pressed him on making sure that the United Nations is able to conduct that inquiry. So does our committee, and that's what we want the Saudis to do. We're not letting the Saudis off the hook.
And if they refuse?
We want to follow the evidence. What's that? I didn't
if they refuse, would you say halt the sales if they refuse to let in an independent UN inquiry?
We would have to review the position. The Saudis have been very upfront by saying, look, we've made mistakes, we want to investigate them, we want to do it transparently. We call on the British government to actually engage and help them in doing that. We also call on the British government to make sure that our personnel and that the government actually knows what our personnel are actually doing on the ground.
Chris White.
So this report is not in any way a let-off.
Chris White, do you think this is a principled position taken by Crispin Blunt and his colleagues?
I don't want to comment on Crispin Blunt's position. I do think, however,
that speaks volumes, but you can't say it is a principled decision.
We have given the Saudis a great deal of time to come forward with their evidence, with their investigations. That is not happening as the way it should be, and I think it would be right and proper, unless there are things we should not know, to give the UN an opportunity to see what has happened.
Chris White, Nadeem Zahawi, thank you both very much indeed.
Now, there have long been claims that we are much too close to Saudi Arabia. It is a mostly stable country in an unstable region, it's true, but by most reckonings, it's governed by a highly autocratic regime with a very questionable human rights record. Since it started bombing targets in Yemen more than a year ago, there have been accusations that British-made weapons are being used in attacks that break international law. The Saudis, with British and American support, have been trying to restore Yemen's former president and contain rebel fighters. Finally today, MPs said enough was enough and called for a halt in arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
The Emir of Qatar was in town today. He and the Prime Minister discussed Brexit, Syria and the World Cup. But only after prompting did Downing Street admit they also talked about Yemen, where Qatar is part of a Saudi-led coalition fighting Houthi rebels. But the conduct of that war has been highly controversial. Earlier this year, ITV News reported from Mustaba near the Saudi border, where 119 people, including 24 children, were killed in a coalition airstrike. And today, 2 House of Commons committees said UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia must stop while alleged breaches of international law are investigated.
The government needs to take action to push for United Nations-led international investigation and also to, until that time happens that investigation can take place, that we pause in the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia.
But in an almost unheard of parliamentary dispute, another committee of MPs had said arms sales should continue until the claims of atrocities are verified.
I think it's important to remember that Saudi Arabia and the coalition of other countries are acting under a UN mandate. It is a UN Security Council resolution which has put this coalition together. And so it should be the UN that determines this outcome of this by setting up an independent inquiry.
And of course, Britain has spent years developing a relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is regarded as a key strategic ally in the fight against international terrorism. Downing Street says the key test for continued arms sales to the Saudis is whether there is a clear risk they might be used for serious violations of international humanitarian law. Campaigners say that test has been met. But so serious have been the reports of human rights violations in Yemen that a High Court judge has granted one campaign group a judicial review of British arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
The fact that this judicial review is even taking place is a sign that there is a real clear risk that UK arms are being used to violate international humanitarian law. And the UK has been called out by some of the most respected NGOs in the world. Some of the abuses which have been carried out by Saudi forces have been documented by the United Nations.
The UN thinks 3,800 civilians have been killed in the 18-month campaign, and in that time it's thought Britain has sold £3.7 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia. Increasingly, MPs are joining campaigners in saying that must stop. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, Westminster.
Now, a story we have covered a lot on this programme. Select committee reports on the legality of UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia are looking a lot like buses tonight. You wait ages for one and then two come along at once. Confusingly, the first, which is a joint effort by the Business and International Development Committees, deemed it inevitable that any violations of international humanitarian and human rights law by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen have involved arms supplied from the UK. Some expected this to trigger a demand for all such exports to be suspended. But the Foreign Affairs Select Committee today published a rival report insisting that the legality of arms sales to Saudi should be decided by the High Court. The chair of that committee, Crispin Blunt, has been speaking to Newsnight's foreign correspondent Gabriel Gatehouse with some, frankly, remarkable results. But before we hear about them, I thought it would be helpful for us to pick Gabriel's brains about just how this strange Select Committee stalemate has come to pass, Gabriel.
James, a little bit of the background on this. The Saudi-led coalition's action over Yemen started in March last year after Houthi rebels, who are backed by Iran, took over half the country. Their action is backed by the UN Security Council, so it's legal under international law. Both sides are being accused of committing war crimes, but the UN has come out with these figures that 60% of civilian casualties have been caused by airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition. And this programme and others have reported instances of attacks on civilian infrastructure, factories, schools, and the like. Now, where Britain comes into this is that we know that Britain sells a lot of weapons to Saudi Arabia, a 30-fold increase in our sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia in the first year of that war compared to the same period in the previous year. So earlier this year, 4 select committees came together to look at this question of are our arms sales to Saudi Arabia still legal? Now, this committee was made up of MPs from 4 committees, Foreign Affairs, Defence, International Development and Business. And last week, we got a leaked draft report of that with some very, very strong language. It said there was credible evidence of violations of human rights, and it called for a suspension of sales. We then got the leaked tabled amendments, many of them written by Crispin Blunt, which appeared to get rid of a lot of that language, crucially the call for the suspension of arms sales to Saudi. Now, there was turmoil, disagreement amongst MPs, and Crispin Blunt led a walkout of some so that this committee couldn't come to a quorum. So what happened then was an almost unprecedented situation which we have today of these 2 rival reports, as you said, the one for business and international development calling for a suspension, both of them calling for an international investigation, but crucially Crispin Blunt from the Foreign Affairs Select Committee not calling for that suspension. Now, we've had a lot of talk about process, but I wanted to talk about substance. So I went to see Crispin Blunt in his constituency this afternoon, and here's some of our conversation.
What's at stake here is are two things: the rule of law and what's in the wider public interest. And under the rule of law, there has been an illegal armed rebellion in the Yemen,
which we all agree on. I think
it's very important for people to understand the context.
And the Saudi intervention is backed by the United Nations, so therefore it's legal under international law. But they're also obliged to abide by international humanitarian
and of course
law.
they're obliged to international humanitarian law.
That's what's at issue here.
And then
your colleagues say there's been very credible evidence of violations, and you say it's just allegations.
The issue is about whether there's been an actual breach of international humanitarian law that would then bring a responsibility on the British government to act in a particular way. I don't believe this law has been tested in this way before. It is obviously a proper place for that to happen is the courts, and that's what the Foreign Affairs Committee are saying.
Your colleagues in the other committee say that while we wait for the courts to decide that, we should suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia in case arms that we sell them are being used in violation of international law. That's completely disappeared from your report.
It has, because the view of my committee is that it would be an act close to insanity on every grounds to do a blanket suspension of British arms exports to Saudi Arabia.
What about a selective suspension? What about the selective suspension of the kinds of bombs that we know, kinds of bombs sold by Britain to Saudi Arabia, which we know have been dropped on civilian targets in Yemen?
And the implications of that, some of those are laser-guided bombs, giving the Saudis the capability through a proper targeting process to actually hit what they're intending to hit. And if we stop supplying them those weapons, they then may have to turn to less guided weapons, the kinds that the Russians have been using in Syria, for example, where the accusation is...
But that's a false argument. If we are contravening our own laws by selling weapons to Saudi Arabia that are being used in contravention of international humanitarian law, and the test is very low. It's if there's a clear risk that these weapons might be used in contravention of international humanitarian law, then we must stop doing it.
And then we're going to have to see how the judges interpret that. The practical consequences of that are actually disastrous for everybody. It would mean our relationship with the Saudis and the influence we have over them about the joint interest we have is that they are rigorous in making sure there are no breaches of international humanitarian law,
but that
they put their armed forces under the same kind of standards that we do,
but we clearly don't have that influence because look at all these pages of evidence
in that direction. Well, the context this has got to be in, and this is exactly why the Foreign Affairs Committee has probably come to a different conclusion to the others, is this is actually about our wider relationship with Saudi Arabia, as well as the more narrow relationship about the Saudis moving to our standards in terms of conducting a military campaign.
But our relationship with Saudi Arabia is irrelevant if we're breaking our own laws. Then surely we have to change the law.
Well,
do you think we should change the law?
That is in the Foreign Affairs Committee report that we would, if it turned out that the courts decided we were in breach of our law, we should then look at the whole legal framework.
So we should soften our stance on
the
criteria under which we license our arms exports.
We might have to.
I think some people may look at all of this evidence that has accumulated over 18 months of what's been going on in Yemen and conclude that either you're naive, gullible, or something worse.
Well, they might think that you were naive and gullible, and
Why?
the people who come to the other conclusion.
Why would they think
because
that?
There is a war going on in the Yemen. This is about international legal authority trying to suppress an illegal armed rebellion, and we believe in the rule of law, and the illegal armed rebellion has to be addressed. Otherwise, it's the law of the jungle, and the people in the Yemen are then victims of whichever militia armed group can impose their will on those people.
Chris Blunt, thank you very much.